We are counting down the 10 most insane early American locomotives ever built. Machines so risky, experimental, and unpredictable, it is hard to believe they were ever allowed near a passenger. From boilers that exploded without warning, to engines so heavy they smashed their own wooden tracks, to strange jumping contraptions and armored behemoths built for war, this list moves from reckless invention to outright chaos. Each entry gets wilder, with disasters, breakthroughs, and even trains that required passengers to pray before boarding. Which locomotive pushed the limits the farthest, and what price did America pay for this wild ride? Let us begin our countdown with number 10. In 1831, the best friend of Charleston thundered down the tracks, steam hissing from every seam. Built just a year before, it was the pride of South Carolina. A brand new American locomotive meant to pull passengers faster than any horse. But on June 17th, a single act of impatience turned the train into a nightmare. The fireman, fed up with the piercing shriek of the safety valve, jammed it shut with a stick. Pressure built behind the iron shell, hotter and hotter, until the boiler exploded with a roar that shook Charleston. Metal shards tore through the air, killing the fireman instantly and injuring nearby workers. Newspapers called it a disaster. The coroner's report blamed both the fireman's mistake and the engine's design. Families received compensation, and the railroad scrambled to add new safety rules. But the fear was real. America's first fatal locomotive explosion had just shown the country how deadly steam power could be. In 1829, a hulking iron machine called the Stourbridge Lion arrived from England, ready to make history on American rails. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company wanted a steam engine that could outpace horses, and they got one, at least on paper. Weighing in at about 7.5 tons, the Lion looked impressive, but there was a problem. The tracks were made of wood, not iron. On August 8th, engineer Horatio Allen climbed aboard for the first test run, alone, just in case things went wrong. As the Lion chugged forward, the wooden rails cracked and splintered under its weight. Boards bowed, spikes popped, and the engine's wheels chewed through the track like it was nothing. Company board members watched in disbelief as their expensive import nearly destroyed the entire line. The Stourbridge Lion never ran a commercial trip. Its short, disastrous debut proved one thing: American railroads needed engines and rails built for American ground, not borrowed from Britain. Early in the 1830s, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad rolled out a new breed of engine that looked nothing like the polished giants to come. These were the B.O. grasshopper locomotives, small, upright, and powered by a pair of vertical rods that pumped up and down with every piston stroke. The rods snapped and jerked so violently that the whole engine would rock and bounce along the rails. Crews started calling them grasshoppers because riding one felt like clinging to a giant insect in a storm. Workshop diaries from machinists mention bolts rattling loose after just a few miles. One engineer joked it was like riding a grasshopper in a thunderstorm. Sometimes the rods would jam or even break, sending the engine lurching sideways. At low speeds, passengers laughed. At higher speeds, they held on for dear life. These wild rides showed that early American railroading was as much about surviving the journey as reaching the destination. By the late 1830s, American railroads wanted more power, and they got it by building bigger, longer boilers packed with fire tubes. These so-called monster boilers looked unstoppable, but their thin iron plates and overlapping seams hit a deadly flaw. Every time the pressure rose, cracks formed along the seams. Corrosion from untreated water ate away at the rivets and plate edges, especially where 3 layers overlapped. Sometimes, just a drop in water level or a stuck safety valve turned these engines into rolling bombs. Accident records from the 1840s describe boilers bursting with a roar that sent twisted iron flying hundreds of feet, shattering sheds and killing bystanders. Some fragments landed a quarter-mile away. Inquest reports read like horror stories: blinding steam, burning coal, a rain of metal. These repeated disasters forced railroads to rethink everything. Inspectors started checking for hidden cracks, and states began to pass the first boiler safety laws. The age of trial and error was ending, replaced by rules written in the aftermath of catastrophe. On July 10, 1836, a crowd gathered at the base of the Belmont Plain, a steep, 3% grade outside Philadelphia that most experts said was impossible for any locomotive to climb. The engine waiting at the bottom was the Norris Antelope, built by William Norris and Company, and it looked nothing like the fragile or explosive machines that had come before. Instead, Antelope was built for power, with heavy iron wheels gripping the rails and a boiler designed to push past the limits of the day. As the signal was given, steam poured from the stack, and the Antelope started up the slope, hauling cars behind it. The grade was so steep that horses had always been used before. This time, the engine did all the work. Step by step, wheel by wheel, it climbed the incline in less than 15 minutes. People at the summit cheered, church bells rang out, and headlines the next day called it a triumph for American engineering. For the first time, a locomotive had beaten the mountain. The Antelope's climb proved that American-built engines could conquer the country's toughest terrain. Instead of disaster, the story was one of victory, opening the door to bigger dreams, longer rail lines, and a new era where steam power would carry passengers and freight over hills that once seemed untouchable. In 1831, a new kind of locomotive arrived in America. It did not explode, jump, or split the rails. The John Bull came from Robert Stephenson and Company in England, and the Camden and Amboy Railroad put it to work on American soil. Right from the start, this engine did something no one expected. It just kept running. Day after day, year after year, the John Bull pulled passengers and freight across New Jersey, clocking more than 3 decades of steady service. By the time other engines had blown up or been scrapped, John Bull was still chugging along, earning a reputation as the first true workhorse of American rail. Engineers tinkered with its design, adding a leading truck to help it handle sharp American curves, a cowcatcher to clear debris, and a protective cab for the crew. Its improved brakes and coupling rods set the standard for future locomotives. Maintenance logs from the Camden and Amboy show careful repairs and regular tune-ups, no wild experiments, just solid engineering. Passengers who once feared for their lives now trusted the John Bull to get them home on time. When the engine finally retired in 1866, it had served for 35 years, longer than any other locomotive of its time. But John Bull's story did not end there. In 1893, engineers at the Smithsonian dusted off the old machine, fired it up for the Chicago World's Fair, and watched it run under its own steam once again. In 1981, at age 150, John Bull became the oldest operable steam locomotive in the world, a living link to the dawn of American railroading. Today, it sits in the Smithsonian, preserved for future generations, proof that reliability, not risk, built the backbone of the nation's railroads. April 12, 1862. The sun rose over Big Shanty, Georgia, and a quiet passenger train called the General waited at the station. In the crowd, a group of Union spies disguised as civilians climbed aboard. Their leader, James Andrews, had a plan that would turn a simple train ride into the most daring railroad heist of the Civil War. When the conductor and crew stepped away for breakfast, Andrews and his men sprang into action. They uncoupled the cars, fired up the engine, and roared north, leaving a trail of confusion and panic in their wake. Within minutes, Confederate telegraph wires sizzled with urgent messages. "The General is gone!" Southern commanders scrambled, ordering every available engine and crew to give chase. The pursuit that followed became a race against time and steam, with the General tearing through enemy territory at breakneck speed. Andrews's men worked desperately, ripping up rails, cutting telegraph lines, and burning bridges to slow their pursuers. Behind them, Confederate engineers commandeered whatever engines they could find, switching from the Yonah to the William R. Smith, then the Texas, sometimes running in reverse at full throttle just to close the gap. As the chase thundered across northern Georgia, every mile brought new hazards. Sabotage tracks, downed wires, and the constant threat of capture kept both sides on edge. Harper's Weekly published engravings of the chase, showing engines barreling through forests and towns, smoke pouring from their stacks. The General's boiler strained under the pressure, but the real limit was fuel. Andrews's men ran out of wood and water just south of Chattanooga. Cornered and exhausted, the Union raiders scattered into the woods. Most were caught within days. 8 were hanged as spies. Others escaped or were exchanged in prisoner swaps. The Great Locomotive Chase was more than a wild story. It proved that railroads had become weapons of war, prizes to be stolen, sabotaged, and fought over. From that day forward, every commander knew, control the rails, and you control the fate of armies. By the time the Civil War broke out, steam engines were not just for hauling troops or supplies, they became rolling weapons. The Union Army took ordinary locomotives and rail cars and turned them into iron-plated monsters. Crews bolted thick sheets of railroad iron, sometimes up to 1 inch thick, onto wooden frames. Inside, soldiers crouched with rifles, ready to fire through narrow slits. At the heart of these armored trains, artillery crews loaded field cannons, 12-pounder Parrott rifles, and sometimes even heavier guns, all pointed straight down the track. War Department reports from 1862 show these trains patrolling the Baltimore and Ohio line, their armor tested against musket fire and flying shrapnel. Union soldiers called them iron monsters. Field photos show battered engines, blackened by powder, with ragged flags flying above. In battle, these machines rolled right up to enemy lines, firing shells at ambushes and burning blockades. But they were not invincible. If the rails ahead were ripped up, the whole train could be stranded, trapped under fire. Still, the armored rail battery was something new. Warfare powered by steam and steel, reshaping the battlefield with every mile of track. Iron rails ripped from the ground, bolted to timber, and hammered into rough shapes. This was Confederate armor, built in desperation as Union forces pressed the South on every front. In 1862, near Richmond, Southern engineers took whatever metal they could find. Old rails, battered boiler plates, shipyard scraps. They fastened that metal over locomotives and rail cars. The result looked like a rolling fortress more than a train. Its sides sloped like a warship, with loopholes cut for rifles and cannon. Soldiers crouched behind these makeshift shields, ready to fire through narrow slots at any blue uniform that appeared along the line. One of the most famous of these ironclads, sometimes called the Railroad Merrimac, rolled into battle at Savage's Station. Its heart was a heavy naval gun, braced with timber and iron, aimed straight down the rails. When Union troops advanced, the armored train opened fire. The boom echoed through tangled woods and smoky air. Federal artillery answered. Shells slammed into the iron and sent splinters flying. The armor could stop bullets, but not big guns. Every shot was a gamble with survival. Confederate crews knew the risk. Sabotage tracks could strand them in enemy fire. Their armor was thick enough to turn a rifle ball, but thin enough that a direct hit from a cannon could rip the car apart. Still, these trains bought precious time, holding off Union advances and spreading panic wherever they appeared. No polished blueprints, no factory standards, just raw American ingenuity, fighting for every mile of rail with whatever scraps were left. The South's ironclad trains were the last line of defense, and sometimes the last hope. By the 1840s, American railroads were running out of second chances. New experimental engines rolled out of workshops across the country with no names, only numbers or initials painted on their sides. The stakes were high. Some engines lasted a single trip, others never made it past the station. The danger was everywhere, and everyone knew it. Stories spread about boilers bursting before the first mile, sending iron and steam into crowds. Newspapers filled columns with grim headlines. Locomotive explodes, several dead. Passengers stood on wooden platforms, clutching tickets and watching engineers test pressure gauges with nervous hands. There were no federal rules, no inspectors with checklists. Just hope and maybe a whispered prayer. Some railroads even told travelers to trust in Providence before stepping aboard. People rode with fear. Survivors told of engines that shook apart at speed, of fireboxes that blew out, of men thrown from cabs by blasts. One infamous case saw a brand new engine's boiler burst within sight of the depot, hurling fragments through windows and leaving bystanders burned and blinded. The images were horrific. Public outcry grew with every accident. Angry letters filled editors' desks. State lawmakers argued about what to do as the death toll climbed. By the late 1840s, the message was clear: something had to change. The first boiler inspection laws arrived, slow and piecemeal, but they offered hope. Railroads hired inspectors, demanded better iron, and forced builders to follow new safety codes. The wildest experiments faded away. In their place came the American 440, a design so reliable it would dominate the rails for 50 years. This was the end of the pray before boarding era. The reckless days of exploding engines and single-run disasters had pushed America to the edge. But from the wreckage came real progress, a promise that the rails would carry people, not just risk, into the future. Across all 10 insane locomotives, one truth stands out. America's railroads were forged through chaos, risk, and relentless trial and error. Innovation didn't wait for safety, it demanded courage, and sometimes paid in disaster. That pattern still shapes progress today. The rails we trust now are built on the bones of bold experiments. Which entry shocked you most? Let us know in the comments below.